Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with really one of the most fascinating economists and historians I've ever come across, Deirdre McCloskey. Formerly Donald McCloskey, Deirdre is a truly epic collection of works, a trilogy called The Bourgeois Era, that talks about the great enrichment in human wealth and prosperity that's happened over the course of the past several centuries. And we really dive into what she discovered through the process of writing these books. Enjoy. So, Deirdre, I wanted to start off with a little bit about your personal story, and really, I have heard your name come up from so many interesting thinkers that I follow, and in regards to your work on, the history of modern Western civilization. One of the most prominent ones is there's a video on the Charles Koch website that quotes you as referring to the sort of hockey puck increase in life, quality of life as the great enrichment.
Yeah, the hockey stick, not the puck so much.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, that's right. The hockey stick. Shows you how much of a hockey fan I am. But.
Well, I grew up in New England, but I didn't ever learn to skate backwards, so I was never a hockey player.
So how did you first get interested in politics and economics? Like, where was your first sort of political economic thought?
Well, when I was about 15 or maybe 16, in my local Carnegie-built library, there's kind of a irony there, I found the socialist classics. In particular, Prince Kropotkin, a great late 19th century prince of the Russian Empire, who was an anarchist. He was a left anarchist. He was not only against the government, he was against property, and that was my first politics. It was very inspiring. He has a book called. That he wrote somewhat later in early 20th century called Mutual Aid, which is still an interesting book. He was trained as a biologist. And then I became a kind of Joan Baez socialist because it was the era of folk music, right? Pete Seeger and all that. And that was again from the left. My parents were they started in the 30s as FDR Democrats. My father became more conservative as he got older, but my mom didn't. So I was in a Nixon-hating household, and we were Democrats, and a friend of mine was Steve Schlesinger, whose father was a big figure in Democratic politics. So I was kind of a left-wing Democrat by the time I went to college. And then I started to study economics. And that sort of drifted away, that conviction that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. I started to get over that and became a Keynesian, though, still a Democrat. My first vote was for Lyndon Johnson in 1964.
And just real for the layperson, what is a Keynesian?
Well, it came out of the Great Depression of the 1930s, and John Maynard Keynes rhymes with brains, and he certainly had a lot of them. Keynes believed that in a circumstance of mass unemployment like 1933, when a quarter of the labor force was unemployed in the United States and Germany, the smart thing is for the government to step in and spend a lot to prime the pump, as even non-economists thought of it at the time. And it became the orthodoxy in American economics and in large parts of European economics after after World War II. And I was part of that. And we all thought I was at Harvard College, and our idea was that we were the elite and we'd all go down to Washington and run your life by fine-tuning the economy because we were very confident that we understood booms and busts and economic growth and so forth. Now, in the end, it proved that we didn't understand booms and busts, and we didn't understand economic growth. We didn't understand a damn thing, but we thought we did. And with the arrogance of youth, we felt that way. And then in graduate school, I stayed at Harvard and became a kind of economic engineer. But then I gradually became interested in history. I'd always been interested in history, and started to do economic history, using economics to think about old economies. Britain in particular, because I was terrible at languages, and it had to be English or I wouldn't be able to study it. And so I started to see that supply and demand economics, sort of Chicago school type real economics, could actually be applied to understanding the economy. That there's no secret way to get rich by spending more, which is what the Keynesians basically thought. So I stopped being a Keynesian, and gradually, even before I went to Chicago, I was tending towards being a Chicago school economist. And then my first job for 12 years was at the University of Chicago, 1968 to 80, when I left in disgust and irritation. Milton Friedman was a colleague, and it was a very exciting time for economics at Chicago. And I learned a lot, and then I've continued to, I don't know, it's sort of that's why my forehead is sloped so much. I keep hitting my forehead and saying, "Oh my God, oh." I keep noticing things that any sensible person would have noticed decades before. So I've gradually become more what they call an Austrian economist. And then by the end, I'm an old person. I call myself a advocate for humanomics, by which I mean you keep the economics, keep the math and the theory and so forth, but you also include evidence from the humanities, plays and letters and novels and so forth, and philosophy and history. And so you're looking at all the evidence for how an economy works. So that's a brief discussion of my entire career. I've been everything, in other words.
Well, and you've written so many books and been so prolific. What drew your... So you're, when we last spoke, you had said, I used to be a Marxist.
Yeah, I did.
So, could you just, in a way, like lay out as a historian what was in the air when Marx hits the scene? I've been reading about this because we're working on a project that involves Mises and Marx, and I'm trying to understand what Marx is criticizing in the late 1800s, and what is, because he's not the first socialist. He's not, and maybe not even the best one as far as thinkers, but he certainly ends up being the most prominent. So give me a sense of your understanding of who Marx was and like where his thought landed in the sweep of history, if you will.
Well, he claimed to be scientific. it's scientific materialism that he advocated. And it was not kind of a soft, oh, let's be kind to the poor socialism, although I in fact advocate that. I could call myself a Christian economist now that I'm an Anglican or an Episcopalian, and I regard I think we have an obligation to help the poor. So there's a kind of a soft socialism that he was disdainful of. He felt that he had the key to history, that he knew what the future would bring. Of course, he was a student of Hegel, and Hegel is a very interesting figure. He was as you know, an early 19th century German philosopher at the great new University of Berlin, which from 1810 on was essentially the first modern research university. And Hegel had a lot of students. And some, like Marx, went left, some went right. So in a way, Hegel is the origin of both socialism and fascism. But in any case, the time was ripe for socialism, partly because the gain to poor people from economic growth seemed to be slow in coming. Had it happened quickly, it didn't. It was slow. 1% a year, 2% a year? Socialism would not have happened. And indeed, in the United States, socialism wasn't ever popular because most Americans felt blessed, I'm talking about the 19th century, felt blessed to be in the United States anyway, at least if you weren't black or queer or a woman or something terrible like that. So socialism couldn't get a grip in the United States.
And define socialism for me, at least in terms that would be understood at that time. I want to later in our conversation come to the present and what the term means now. But in that, what did socialism mean at the time that Marx is writing?
It meant the abolition of private property. That is, the turning of the economy over to planners. Or to put it another way, it was the elimination of the voluntary in the economy and turning the economy over to compulsion. As Lenin famously said in the 1920s, we want the whole economy to operate like a giant factory, by which he meant pointing out that in a factory, the boss is the boss. The boss tells you what to do. You don't have any choice in the matter. Of course, now you can leave and Ford Motor Company, but you can't leave Russia. That was the only trouble with that analogy. But in any case, the idea was that we're going to make this economy more efficient and less unstable by planning it. So along with this matter of the payoff not coming fast enough, the other element was this the scientism of the age. This is the 19th century. Science is triumphing. Now, I don't think actually high science was that important until around 1900 in affecting the economy. I think most of the inventions and improvements in organization didn't have much to do with, celestial mechanics or Newton or something. But anyway, people believed that it was the age of science, and that got a stronger and stronger grip on people's imagination, particularly after Darwin in 1859. So with Newton and Darwin, we're going to have science, and we need a science of society. That had been an ambition of lots of people, like my great hero Adam Smith, for example, for a long time. And Marxism and socialism looked like the application of scientific methods to society. But the version of science that people had in mind was this very authoritarian, top-down, you do what I say as an expert. And there were people in the 19th century who complained about it, but it became more and more fashionable. By 1900, in places like Britain and the United States, socialism was viewed increasingly as the wave of the future. So we're going to take away private property, which they claimed was intrinsically exploitative, and we're going to plan everything, and that's going to make for a beautiful society in which people can work a little in the morning and play the cello or write poetry in the afternoon.
There's this term that I know Mises attacks in his book Socialism, and that is the notion of rational economic planning, right? So now what does this mean? What does this mean, rational, in this context?
Well, as Hayek pointed out, and maybe he got it from Mises, I'm not sure, in the 18th century, there were two aspects of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. One was the liberty side, that we're going to free people and allow them to have a go. That's the freedom side. But there was also a very strong rational side, that we're going to lay down the future and we're going to have plans and we're going to make the whole society into one big factory. That was very much began in the 1700s. And so those two sides of the Enlightenment have been fighting with each other ever since. So so the Democrats, for example, most of the Democrats are very willing to bring in the government to compel people to do things. And once the Republicans were more libertarian, but they appear to have gotten lost in that way. So anyway, there are those two sides, and they're in constant conflict with each other.
So Marx has this sense of, I mean, it's funny because it's the antithesis of Darwin, right? So you've got this moment of Darwin, who, from what I understand, Darwin was.
That's right.
I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, that Darwin was actually inspired by Adam Smith.
Oh, he actually said so. Not Smith, but by Malthus, the great theorist of population, who was an Anglican clergyman and a great economist. In fact, Malthus was also the inspiration of Keynes, person we mentioned before. And yeah, that's right. In his autobiography, Darwin describes himself reading Malthus for pleasure one evening, which gives you an idea of how what a scholarly person Darwin was. And it suddenly hit him that the struggle for existence among humans was similar to the struggle among existence for plants and animals. So yeah, no, and in fact, the biology has repaid the favor in some ways, because there are evolutionary economists. The great Armin Alchian at UCLA was an example of this, and Hayek talks this way. He was trained as a biologist, and the point about evolution is that you can't tell what's going to happen next.
Right. So there's no rational planning. There's no 5-year planning for evolution.
No. Now there's a kind of distortion of evolution, which you get in social Darwinism and racism very strongly in the late 19th and early 20th century. Everyone was a racist in 1910. Everywhere. It was appalling. These great scientists, this wasn't pseudoscience, this was science, and it was wrong in every sense of wrong. And they believed that they knew by 1910 which the superior races were. And surprise, surprise, it turned out to be, as President Trump has said, Norwegians. And so that's not what Darwin said. Darwin said there's no direction to evolution. There is no predicting evolution. This is completely different from Newton. Newton, a century and a half before, had his science was about prediction. You can know where the moon's going to be next year because you know where it is now, and you know the equations, the differential equations, indeed, that govern its motion and the motion of the Earth and the sun and everything. And you can predict down to the inch where, theoretically, where it's going to be next year. Whereas the crucial point that Manifesto have said is, look, you can't predict technology, you can't predict innovation. I wrote a book in 1990 called If You're So Smart, The Narrative of Economic Expertise, which discussed this point at some length. And I said, look, if you were so smart as to know where the economy, or I don't know, where the turning point of the business cycle is the business cycle, as it's going to turn in 2019 or 2020? I don't know. If I knew I could make an unlimited fortune. So there's something really deeply economically wrong about the claim that Marx made that you could predict the future of the economy.
I think in some sense, is it fair to say that this sort of economic planner mentality is sort of the economic equivalent of creationism? Because that's sort of, I mean, in a sense, you've got this.
Yeah,
you've got this sort of
it
Godhead planner. I mean, I'm a Catholic.
That's right.
I don't reject. I'm not saying this as a criticism of religion, but
no.
This notion that if the free marketeers are the Darwinists, in the true sense of like, well, we don't know, and that's why you need entrepreneurs to be out there.
Yeah, that's right.
Competing like species,
looking around, being alert, as Israel Kirzner says.
Then you've got this other view.
Yeah, that's right.
So then what is his? So you said that he felt he'd sort of cracked the code of history.
Yes, he did.
And so that he had like a Newtonian physics of history, if you will. So what was that, and what did it imply?
Well, his famous sentence, and when I read this first in the Communist Manifesto, I thought, aha, this is the key to history, and I don't need to read any more. I was a very unscholarly Marxist, I have to say. But in the Communist Manifesto, he says, in the translation, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. And that kind of framework he got from Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's called, as you know, the dialectic. And what's wrong with what Marx said? And there are lots of things. I'm fond of saying to my conservative friends that Marx was the greatest social scientist of the 19th century without compare, and that makes them angry, and they say, I hate you. And then I say to my left-wing friends, and he got everything wrong, and that makes them angry, which is why I don't have any friends. He thought that he could predict with this mechanism of class struggle, which is deeply stupid in many ways, because it acts as though classes were people. Whole groups of people act as though they had one mind. And it's been said frequently that just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, he thought, aha, I can see how it's going to work out. When finally class division is complete, when property is eliminated, class division will go away, and we'll have one class called us, the proletariat, and that will be the end of history. And that's what he expected would happen. Now, of course, what actually happens is the Communist Party of China is a new aristocracy. So you haven't got rid of class divisions at all. You've just changed their name.
Right. You now you have the legal ruling class and everyone else, as opposed
Exactly.
to
everyone else.
the class being defined by wealth or some other mechanism.
That's right.
So he has some predictions, right? That I think we can at least evaluate on their face. Like, what are some of his predictions based on this sense of the path of history?
Well, there was a great Marxist economist. It's kind of hard to think of that, but there was. Her name was Joan Robinson. She was at Cambridge University. Was a friend of Keynes, a young friend of Keynes in the 30s. And was a very good economist, in my opinion, and should have got the Nobel Prize, but for various reasons didn't. But she was a good economist. She understood that these statements by Marx had to be wrong, because he said three things. He said that there would be great technological change in the future, and in that he was correct. And he was one of the few economists of the time, we're talking about the middle of the 19th century, who realized this. John Stuart Mill, who's another one of my heroes, didn't understand how powerful the role of technological improvement would be, technological and institutional improvement. So that's number one fact. Number two claim, or it became a fact, number two prediction was that the working class would be steadily immiserized. And number three is that the rate of profit for the capitalists would fall and fall and fall.
Why? Why would it fall?
Well, competition and periodic collapses and blah, blah. It's kind of vague, but that was the idea, that all three of those things would happen. Now, as Joan Robinson pointed out, those are inconsistent. Because if there's technical change, we're inventing electricity and cheap steel and automobiles and so forth, then the pie is getting bigger. And someone's got to get it. If it's not the working class, it's got to be the capitalist class. So it can't be true that both the wages go down and the rate of profit on capital go down. This is ridiculous. One of them has to go up. And in fact, what actually happened in the last 150 years is that the rate of profit didn't go up, or down for that matter. In investment in the modern world earns about what it earned in the middle of the 19th century. But what spectacularly went up is the real wages of workers. It's the proletariat that massively was enriched by technical change.
So I want to pause there for a second and ask you to sort of give me an example. So I'm your average person, and I hear this statement, and for some reason, and I know this to be true from a recent experience on a film I just completed. Something like 75% of people, when asked, has life for the poor gotten better or worse over the past 40, 50 years? Never mind 150.
Yeah.
Say, oh, it's definitely gotten worse. The poor have gotten poorer.
Yeah.
And it's a quick Google search to prove that totally false. But paint a picture for me of how materially different life has become for the bottom 10%.
Well, they should read or go to the website of a great Swedish professor of public health who died last year, named Hans Rosling, Rosling, Hans Rosling. And he's got a book called Factfulness, which came out just last year. It was published after he died. And it makes an overwhelmingly powerful case that, say, in the last 50 years, the poor of the world have been raised up. Now, the problem that people have is that they know there are still poor people in the world. You know, they see them begging on the street here in Chicago, for example. They think, God, that would be terrible to think that the poor have gotten better off, because look, the person I give $1 to at the convenience store is still begging on the street. But that's to confuse the issue. It's not that that there's no poverty in the world anymore. It's that it's much smaller than it once was. And there are all kinds of ways of showing this. Actually, Hans Rosling, I said, was a professor of public health. So he focuses and makes a good case for focusing on child mortality. In Bangladesh, for example, not long ago, 30 years ago, you'd have 5 or 6 children and 4 of them would die. Okay? Before they were 2 or something. Because they'd get diarrhea and you didn't know what to do about it and blah, blah, blah. They'd get all kinds of illnesses. Now, you have 2 children in Bangladesh as a woman, and they both survive. What's happened in Bangladesh is still a very poor country, is that the birth rate has fallen like a stone, and it's falling worldwide, mainly because of this child mortality thing. People are able to target how many children they want, and people don't want to have 10 children. Most people don't. They want to have 2. I have 2 children, so I understand this. 2 or 3 most. And so that's one example. But if you look around, the problem is that people don't have, they don't believe the numbers, or they don't believe their lying eyes. If you look at old movies from the 30s and 40s, you'll notice, for one thing, everyone is thin. Now, why is that? Well, we're obese, they're thin, they must have been healthier. No, they weren't eating as well. They're shorter than they were. A striking example of this is in Holland. Before the war, before the Second War, the Dutch were short. Now they're giants. Good God, there were undergraduate women at Erasmus University, where I taught in Holland, who were 3 inches taller than I was, and I'm very tall. And you can just go on and on and on. The amount of space that a person has in their life as a child, for example, has gone up. It was commonplace for children in the 30s and 40s to share a bedroom. By now, people think of it as practically as child abuse if each child doesn't have her own room. The size of apartments has increased. The amount of air conditioning has increased. It used to be that in terrible heat waves, which happened as recently as, I believe, 1995 in Chicago, many people would die. Hundreds of people would die. Now, even poor people in Chicago often have access to air conditioning. Medical care, it's obviously better than it was. Air travel is cheaper than it was in real terms. People fly all over the place. Tomorrow I'm going to fly to Colombia, down in South America, and then fly around Colombia and go here and go there. This is crazy. We're much better off. And the rich are getting poorer, is deeply foolish. And the problem is that the official statistics are very misleading. I've spoken to the head of the Consumer Price Index about this, and she agrees that the Consumer Price Index doesn't correctly allow for improvements in quality. Let's take a very simple example. Automobile tires. When I was a kid, automobile tires would last a few thousand miles and then they'd blow out, or you'd have to get a new one.
Yeah, not even a year then.
Often not even a year. It was terrible. You were constantly coming out and finding a flat tire. That's just gone away. Tires are vastly better. So are automobiles, for that matter. They become more complicated, but they're much more reliable than they once were. And on and on and on. It's just, and the quality thing is hard to capture.
Right. The 10 years in iPhone life, it looks like a shocking change.
I know, for example, who needs... I was walking through the Houses of Parliament with an MP in England, and we had just come away from the empty House of Commons that he showed me around. And he was kind of a vain guy, as politicians tend to be. And I noticed that he took his first time I've seen anyone do this, he took his cell phone, turned on the camera, and used it as a mirror to comb his hair. This is what, and who needs a flashlight anymore? You got a flashlight on it goes on and on and on. I just figured out, as stupid as I am at these things, that you can use your smartphone as a magnifier.
Right.
My eyes aren't very good, and you can just hold it. The camera keeps turning off, so I have to figure out how to stop that. But you can hold it over a page, and it magnifies the page. So here we go. I mean, eventually you'll get a microscope in your computer and be able to examine germs with your not your computer, your cell phone.
So to bring this back to this sort of socialist thought, would you say it's then at some level Marx had a zero-sum vision of the world? He just there was no really despite being in favor of technological improvement. Here's what I struggle to understand. So Marx is saying that technology is going to improve dramatically.
Yeah.
He also seems to be pointing towards an end to scarcity.
Yeah. But that's what's so odd about it.
So I don't understand how these things are all hanging together.
Well, but that's what Joan Robinson said. She said, look, this notion of the final crisis of capitalism, which would lead to this nirvana of the socialization of production and the dictatorship of the proletariat, which then would lead to the communist society. Communism, in its most airy-fairy theory, is a theory of anarchism, is a theory, as they said, of the withering away of the state. And as you said, infinite abundance and everything would be cool. That large abundance has come through capitalism, not through socialism. That's what's odd. You have the final crisis of capitalism, which is an extreme case of zero-sum thinking. And yet, at the same time, he knew that technology was much more important. I mean, there's a famous phrase in the Communist Manifesto where they say, the bourgeoisie has created more productive forces in the last century than all the ages before. And that was pretty much correct, although it was only a doubling. It's worth getting this figure into your head. 100% increase in income per head is a good thing, and no doubt about it. We'd all like to double our income without prices going up. That's what we'd like. What actually happened between 1800 and the present in most countries, Finland, Japan, blah, 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 all the countries that have become prosperous, now hear this, is a 3,000% increase. And people can't believe this. They say, 3,000%? What are you talking about? That can't be right. Maybe 100% or 200%, a doubling or a tripling. No. It's a factor of 30 in improvements in all kinds of things. A factor of 30. So if you want to find inequality, go back to 1800. That was extreme inequality, where the rich had orangeries where they could get lots of vitamin C in their backyard, and the poor were actually starving in many of these countries. The last massive European famine was not in Ireland, which is the famous one of the 1840s, but was in Finland in the 1860s, where hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation. But that was the end of it. There was no more, there was isolated pockets of starvation, even in as rich a country as Sweden around the time of the First World War. But the mass starvations, which had been commonplace in the Middle Ages, in all countries, China, India, wherever you want, just went away. And and that, by the way, is worldwide. The famines that happened in the Sudan and Aden and so forth, those are man-made creations. In fact, the last great famine in China was Mao's famine, caused by the Great Leap Forward, as he called it, which was a particularly stupid example of central planning, central direction, which caused tens of millions of people to die of starvation. So, but there are no more, how can I say this? There's a term for it in demography, but I can't remember it. There are no more famines that are caused by harvest failures in the world. Whereas I'm also a student of the Middle Ages, and I can tell you there was a serious famine every 10 or 15 years in England in the 13th and 14th century. I mean, lots of people just died by the side of the road.
This is, I think this sort of underlines something that is this intuitive challenge for people today, which is this sense that the extent to which we rely on other people for basic things,
sure,
makes us vulnerable.
Yeah,
and makes and you know, I don't really know how to grow my own food.
No.
You know, I certainly, if I was suddenly dropped in the wilderness, I'd be dead within a week, probably less.
Me too.
And so there's a very tangible feeling of our fragile, of being fragile.
Yeah.
And yet what you're describing is that we're more protected and more robust in this modern interconnected world than at a time when almost everybody could survive dropped into the middle of nowhere because they had the basic skills to feed themselves and to protect themselves. And this sort of points me to one other question I had in Marx that maybe we don't need to go too far down a rabbit hole on, but in reading his work, he has this concept of alienation.
Yeah.
And it's this notion that, well, because under capitalist production you have the division of labor, which is that people specialize in particular things, and you know, like the Adam Smith pin factory. I'm working on the stems. You're working on the little flat part on top.
Sure.
And so no one person is like responsible for making the whole product.
Yeah.
And then we don't keep the product we make. We all work together to create this thing that's the product of all of our efforts, and then it's sold to somebody else. And Marx saw this as this terrible alienating force that. But then at the same time, I don't understand. He suggests that in this communist future, there would be no division of labor, that we would just create for ourselves what we need. So he seemed to be a smart guy.
Yeah.
So he seemed to understand that division of labor was the reason we had all this increasing stuff.
He did not understand. He did not understand the division of labor. You're exactly right. He had this nostalgia for the old days, when we could do more things, as you said, take care of ourselves by ourselves. And it's a nostalgia that people feel all the time. They're always talking about self-sufficiency and how wonderful that is. And you get exceptionally stupid people like Donald Trump saying this about whole countries, that we don't need to trade with China, we're just going to do it ourselves. And it's very, very foolish. And the problem is that, well, look, my grandmother could do anything. She could make dresses and curtains in an afternoon of whacking away at her sewing machine. She could can vegetables. She was born in the 1890s in Indiana. In the early 20th century, if your children got sick, you didn't take them to the hospital or talk to a doctor. You were their nurse, you as the mother. And there were these big books of home care. If your daughter got scarlet fever, you put her to bed for a month and blah, blah, blah. So she did everything. Whereas my mother was less so, and I'm even less so. As you said, we're more and more specialized. But that, of course, allows us to do things that we couldn't ever do before. I just bought a couple of years ago an accordion. It's one of those small accordions from the Czech Republic. And it's a beautiful little instrument. What, I'm to make it myself? Would that make any sense? I don't know how to build an accordion. But for a moderate expenditure of my labor as a teacher, I can trade and get an accordion. So, it's not just stuff. It's not just junk. You can get an education because you have specialized teachers and chemists and economists and English professors who can teach you a whole bunch of stuff you couldn't possibly have learned by yourself. We're social creatures, we humans are. We're cooperators much more than the other great apes. And it's a wonderful, if we have a free economy, and if the government hasn't closed off trade with other countries, as was happening in the 1930s in a big way, we're secure too. Because if one supplier doesn't have it, another will. And so contrary to the idea that self-sufficiency is secure, it's not secure. If you're growing your own wheat, you're subject to wheat blight. It's called smut, actually, oddly. It's where the word smut comes from. If your crop fails, you're doomed if you're self-sufficient. Whereas I don't, of course, grow my own wheat, but if I needed to, and my crop failed, I could buy some wheat with my saving if I had any. So it's terribly sad that people are still attracted by this socialist vision of central planning and security and self-sufficiency and blah, 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 because it's just no good. And actually, the gross evidence is pretty plain. The coverage of Venezuela seldom mentions that the problem there is socialism, is central planning. But you can depend on it, it is. There are at least 40,000 advisors from Cuba in Venezuela helping the Maduro regime to boss its people around. Every time that socialism has been tried in a thoroughgoing way, it's failed. East Germany versus West Germany, North Korea versus South Korea, Venezuela versus Colombia.
Or Chile.
And people say, oh, but Sweden's is a good case of socialism. No, it's not. Sweden is a capitalist country with a strong safety net and honest public administration. That's all.
It is interesting. I know my good friend Russ Roberts is a student of yours.
Yeah.
And he has this little quip, we tried buy local, it's called the Middle Ages.
Yeah, that's right.
And
he's absolutely right.
And I live in Austin, Texas. I've lived in New York City. I have family in Portland, Oregon. These are three hotbeds of
socialism,
sort of socialistic ethos, and also this sense of I'm going to have a backyard farm, and I'm going to own chickens, and I don't want to cast aspersions on people. I think if you want to have a backyard farm, that's great. I strongly recommend against backyard animals. It's horrendously cruel. So some of the worst animal cruelty in the world is in backyards. Yeah. Like the ethos of buy local and of self-sufficiency and of like returning. And I think maybe Marx was on to something human, or there's something true in our humanity of wanting to make something and hold its completed form in our own hands.
There was tremendous nostalgia about this in the mid-19th century as more and more goods came out of factories. And there were in England, the so-called arts and crafts movement was precisely an assertion of the beauty of the craftsperson making her own thing and complete from beginning to end, choosing the wood, doing this, doing that, and or choosing the weave on the loom.
My wife and I had very personal experience with this. We started a cloth diaper business after our son was born, and we used cloth diapers, and they were very modern looking. They were like a garment. They weren't like the old nappies from a diaper service. And we ran into this amazing problem, which was we both worked at Nickelodeon, so we understood branding, and we came up with this brand, We Huggers, and built a website and had these really cute designs. But we faced this problem of the consumer base, and there was a sizable niche for these kind of products. They really wanted them to be made in the United States.
Yeah.
And they really didn't want to pay for the price it would take to manufacture them in the United States. Yeah. And we scoured the country looking for a textile manufacturer that could produce enough of these in the United States to actually fulfill the demand, because these people buying these things had enough disposable income that they could buy a $18 individual diaper. But if you wanted to make them in the United States, it was going to cost $30. Yeah. And they didn't want to spend that, but they didn't want to get it from China.
Yeah.
Or get it from Bangladesh, or get it from anywhere that actually had the capacity. We spoke to a small textile manufacturer in Newark, New Jersey, and this is a very depressed area economically in Newark.
Yeah, I know.
We were living in. He said, I can't get anyone to come and work in my factory despite paying $20 an hour with full health benefits. This was in 2010. This was in 2010. So this is right in the aftermath of the greatest recession in modern history.
No, not in modern history.
Or in, I guess I could say recent post-war history.
Post-war.
And he can't get anybody to come work on this textile factory. So there's this. You've got this whole bundle of romances. You've got this romance of manufacturing and what nobody wants to do it. Yep. Nobody wants to do those jobs.
Yeah, sure.
So, and then at the same time, you've got this romance of making things locally, as if buying something from a poor person somewhere else is a terrible moral tragedy. God forbid I help somebody that's poor in Bangladesh by buying their product.
Well, on the left, people want to impose American labor standards on Bangladesh. And that's nuts. Bangladesh's income is 1/10 of the per capita of the United States, if that. If you impose such labor standards, no one in Bangladesh will ever be employed again. There's a kind of a myth, a deep myth on the left, which some on the right accept too, without thinking about it very much, which is that the way that the workers get better, this is the zero-sum stuff you were talking about, is by extracting it from the bosses. And the bosses are envisioned as having all this gold in the back room. And if you just strike and protest and pass laws, you can extract endless amounts from that gold in the back room. And, it's crazy, but you see it in French politics a lot.
So so Marx, and I think even modern socialists echo this, the sense of oppressor versus oppressed.
Yes.
And this class warfare, class struggle as
Sure.
the nature of reality, and so the only way to make progress is to put your fist in the air.
That's right.
There's something very strange about an ideology that's supposed to be caring, almost always having.
Well, I was an anti-war person on the left back in the 60s, and I led riots briefly. And I kind of know the excitement of the revolutionary moment. But it's not actually going to make the workers any better off to shift their boss from being someone who pays them to their boss who taxes them.
What's the alternative view to this class warfare, class struggle, historical arc? How else will the Bangladeshis end up better if not by organizing and fighting for their rights, or however you want to think about it?
Well, the market will provide. The other Marx, Groucho Marx, who was the great figure in comedy in the 1930s in Hollywood, had a cruel sense of humor. And he had a friend who was a communist, and George came to him and said, Groucho, I'm starving. I can't get any money for my family. It's terrible. I've got to have a job. And Groucho sent him away saying, George, I wouldn't want to exploit you. And the idea that employment is intrinsically exploitation is the heart of Marxism. The idea that if you pay someone to do something, that's terrible, is the basic complaint that most people have about capitalism, and it's completely crazy.
This is this idea of, like, you hear this wage
slavery,
wage labor,
wage slavery. They call it wage slavery, and I've written some on this. Wage slavery is an incredibly stupid term. It shows that you really don't understand slavery. Slavery is compelling people under threat of physical violence to do stuff that they don't want to do. Wage slavery, not wage slavery, wages are an exchange, my services for yours. That's all it is. In fact, one cant phrase, one commonly heard phrase that doesn't make a lot of sense is "thank you for your service" when you're speaking to someone in uniform. And the trouble with talking that way is that it acts as the only way to give service to the rest of the society is to join the compelling arm of the government, the violent arm of the government. And that's not true. With this exchange, this division of labor, this technological change that we all engage in, we make other people better off. If you were able to sell these nappies, it would have made the people, at least in their own judgment, better off. Although my mom remembers vividly cleaning my diapers, I was born in 1942, down in the basement in big tubs by hand. So I don't know quite what they have in mind. But in any case, cloth diapers are perfectly reasonable. Well, let's have some. And you're doing a service for people. It's obvious. How do you know? Because they pay for it. Whereas whether or not the American Armed Forces is really a service to us is highly questionable. I spoke to what's his name, the senior senator from North Carolina, Lindsey Graham, and I asked him, why do we have 800 bases abroad? And he said, if we don't fight them in Iraq, we'll fight them in Charleston. And it's just nuts. It's not true. Yet people say it all the time. And so the service of being a serviceman, I'm not against soldiers. I have friends who are soldiers, and I admire them, and they put their life on the line, and as do firemen and policemen and so forth. And I have no objection to that. That's good. That's honorable. But they're not unique in giving service. We all give service.
To piggyback on this sense of this sort of romance of the military, the freshman congressman from New York, who's a self-avowed socialist, recently said
she's made quite a stir.
AOC, her hashtag. She recently said something that I know is an echo of post-war sort of left-wing sort of planner mentality, which is we need to marshal the economy in the same way that we marshaled resources during World War II. There's this sort of we won the war, let's win the peace. And I've seen descriptions of sort of socialism and socialist central planning and Marxism. You said it's like, well, we want the whole society to work like one factory, like one hierarchy. But in a sense, what they're really saying is we want the whole of society to be the military.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. That's an excellent point.
And so there's even I've seen references to the sense of armies raised to combat farming and even the sense of like we're going to fight poverty. There's this like militaristic language.
Think of the war on drugs. Think of the war on drugs. The disastrous war on drugs, which has ruined the lives of many black and Hispanic people, even though white people consume per capita more drugs. You have an army, you're liable to conquer someone. Whereas if you have an economy, you're making mutually advantageous exchanges with other people. It's this whole idea. They don't believe in what Hayek called the spontaneous order of but there are lots of other examples besides the economy. Language is the most obvious one. There's no one planning the English language, and we don't need a central planner of the English language because it'll evolve and gradually the grammar and vocabulary will slowly change over the years. It's already happened. In the same way, we don't need anyone planning the economy. It's as Darwin said, it's a evolving system where the choices of what beak the Darwin finches on the island chain of Galapagos should have is made by so to speak, by the birds themselves, specializing in this kind of nut or that kind of nut.
It's like the fitness environment, right? That's this idea that in reading Ludwig von Mises's book Socialism, which was this critique of published in 1920, sort of the first big critique, pushing back against this, this is the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Right.
He makes this point, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. That essentially, far from, like you said you said earlier that there's this notion that the bosses have all this
gold
power over you, and they have all this gold in their
back
safe
room.
In their room.
Yeah.
And it's Jeff Bezos having the most gold of any boss right now. Everyone loves to talk about Jeff Bezos.
Sure, let's go after Bezos.
Never mind that his gold is in the form of stocks that are held by old people's retirement accounts. So it's not quite clear why his gold is not in fact their gold.
Yeah.
But Mises basically says, well, okay, if you think about property, there's a sense that property is the contract, like a stock.
Right.
So, okay, I own a stock, but there's another sense of property that's more tangible and physical of if I'm using something, if I have some level of control over it,
sure,
I have a certain kind of property claim or a certain kind of property use or property right. And he then extends that to say any business that has to have customers in a very real sense is not controlled by the bosses, but it's controlled by the customers. I remember when Apple first released the very first iPhone, and I am an Apple fanatic, and I have 15 Apple devices within arm's reach of me right at this moment. That's not even an exaggeration. They released it at $6.99. It was in like August of 2007. They were already one of the most, quote, powerful, if that term even makes sense, powerful companies in the world. I don't know what that means. Apple has no power over me.
Power should be defined as the use of violence. Power is not tempting you with cloth nappies or electronic devices. That's not power. Power is the power to force people.
So they released this phone. They're in this market power sense, like this super powerful company. It's released for $6.99, and within 2 months they dropped the price by $200.
Sure.
Because it was clearly, no matter how awesome it was just priced too darn high for most people to jump. And so even Apple, with what becomes the most successful product in all of like computing history for certain, had no control really over what people would pay for their product.
Well, the control, the power, market power, this is all nonsense talk. Power should be confined to the use of violence to force people to do things. It's the same point as as wage slavery. It's a contradiction in terms. It's like talking of military intelligence or academic administration. The two words don't go together. They make no sense. And power is the power to force people. And as an economist, I'm very irritated by antitrust, the problem is that people think of a big company, successful company, Google or Microsoft or Apple, as having therefore power. And it's ridiculous. Apple doesn't have any power over you except the power to charm you. In fact, there is a deep sense in which people are suspicious of persuasion. This ties into my earlier work on rhetoric in science, persuasion in science. And since the 17th century, really, the 1600s, in the West, we've been very suspicious of anyone trying to manipulate, that's their favorite word, manipulate me. Trying to, I see, you're trying to persuade me again. You're advertising, or you're trying to get me to do something. But it's completely silly, because free speech, free commercial speech, is the only way we have of making decisions, of deciding things, except power. You can either change a person's mind by taking a gun out and compelling them to do something, or by sweet talk, changing their mind by persuading them of the Pythagorean theorem, or that cloth diapers are wonderful, or whatever.
Yeah, there's this sense, I've done a fair amount of work in advertising. I've directed commercials, and our company produces advertising sometimes. You know, what you call kind of conventional advertising.
Sure.
Not just the advertising of ideas like our rap videos, but
yeah.
There is this incredible anti-advertising
I know.
Cultural thread, and I feel like it also taps into this sense that, well, we can have a post-scarcity world. All we have to do is eliminate everybody's desires.
Yeah.
And the desires are all manufactured by advertisers.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's
I
right.
find this especially strange for anyone that thinks democracy is a good idea.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if people are so stupid that an ad will fundamentally change their mind,
yeah,
why could they be trusted to make democratic choices or vote.
Good point. Yeah.
It's a strange set of. It's democracy seems to always be the religion in the abstract.
Yeah.
Once you have actually people out there trying to convince you of their point of view, well now that's big money, that's dark money, that's manipulation.
That's right. That's manipulation. Yeah, it's very strange. What's odd about it, especially odd about it, is that the deepest suspicion of advertising is not really in Europe or Asia. It's in the United States, which is quite strange because we're a very commercial people and always have been. And yet, since Thorstein Veblen in the early 20th century and John Kenneth Galbraith in the 50s and 60s and again and again and again, this idea that advertising, which is an extremely small percentage of national income, about 2%, most of advertising is informational. And even the stuff that's not informational, things like the Coke is the real thing, function as a bond of quality. First time they find a mouse in a can of Coke is when advertising establishing that Coke is the real thing goes down the drain. So it's a kind of an assurance that the Coca-Cola company is giving to its customers that the company really thinks this is good stuff, and so should you.
I mean, the people often forget that the word brand comes from identity, to brand your cattle with a branding iron. It's a matter of knowing that something is authentic.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not too sympathetic to copyright and patents. But I draw the line at branding. I think we need brands in the world because they summarize and guarantee quality. I mean, look at the marks on sterling silver and so forth. Yeah, that's right. Then you're sure that you're getting actual sterling, and I see no advantage to throwing away brands. Whereas I do see an advantage to throwing away both copyright and patents. I'm very sympathetic to that too, and we'll definitely have to go on have another conversation about that. I wanted to now I have to confess I have not read your bourgeois era trilogy. It is. Oh. Are you a scholarly person or not? You can have it by your bed. Read it every night. It'll only take you about 20 years to read it. Actually, hey, all three of the volumes, quite remarkably, are on audiobooks. The company that made the audiobook said to me, "Look, we have this great man who's going to read it." And I said, "No, you don't. You get a woman to read it." Because, I don't want to be read by a man. Screw that. And so they got this excellent actress, and she read all three volumes very well.
My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you have a central sort of thesis in this work about the role of ideas in creating this great enrichment, and it stands in strong contrast to Marx and to modern socialism and this notion that it's the control of, quote, capital.
Well, and indeed, it stands in contrast to other economists, non-Marxist economists, too.
Lay this out for me.
Well, economists love to talk about capital, whether they're on the left or the right, whether they're Marxists or conservatives, because they think they understand it. You build a building. You need to maintain it, so there's a certain amount of depreciation, and it costs a certain amount, and then it's going to have a return of a certain amount, and that's very nice. And then you can add up the capital from all the buildings in the neighborhood and talk about how much capital there is in this neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very nice sounding. But building a building without a good idea is a terrible idea. So it's clear that investment is not the core of what we conventionally and foolishly called capitalism. The word is not good because it does suggest that it's the accumulation of capital that made the world rich. My friend Bill Easterly at NYU calls it capital fundamentalism. And like me, he thinks it's silly. Piling capital up doesn't make you rich. Now, obviously, if I had tons of money dropped on me, I'd be rich. But a society isn't like that. You just sheer piling up of bricks doesn't give you enrichment. What gives you enrichment is a good idea for the bricks, good ideas of what to build, what to invest in. And those come from technology and to some degree in science, but especially technology, and entrepreneurial vigor and noticing stuff, alertness. And they come in turn from liberalism. In the international sense, the idea that the ideal society is a society with no slaves, all free people who can take this job and shove it. Even if they haven't got very good opportunities, they can do that. They can stop farming in a subsistence way and go to the city and work in a textile mill, and by their own lights, that makes them better off, and the whole economy is made better off by that. So it's the liberal idea, which is very quickly invented in the 1700s in Europe. In the century before, it was thought to be completely crazy. Of course we needed slavery. Of course women should be subordinated to men. Of course young people should be beaten. Of course, we need these hierarchies, people thought. And then the notion that all men and women, are created equal became more and more popular in the 1700s. And by the 1900s, it was actually being applied. The United States finally got rid of slavery. Brazil did too. Slavery in the British Empire was abolished in 1833. Since then, there's been this continuous liberation of people. Poor men, slaves, women, colonial people, gays, women again, transgendered people, blah, blah, blah. You keep freeing people to have a go, as the British say. And out of that came this astonishing era of creativity that we've had since 1800. It's got nothing to do with capital. That's why I want people to start calling our economy not capitalism, but innovism. That's the word, innovism. That's what we've been doing since 1800.
Inventing airplanes, inventing trains.
Inventing trains, and it's not just technology, it's also organizational. As I said, the invention of the modern research university, invention of forward markets, and some things that had very little to do with technology. For example, in 1956, a man named Malcolm McLean invented the container and the container ship, which has revolutionized ocean transport. It's remarkably decreased cost of shipping and made for the second globalization. The first one was in the late 1800s.
That's a great example of something that I think is very hard for people to see, which is if you're tasked with being a planner, whether it's in the Soviet Union or communist China, or in the Department of Health and Human Services for the distribution of resources for Medicare, how you have to be a kind of god.
Yes, you do.
Because how could you possibly know what's going to come? I mean, the shipping container that you just bring up is it's just a box.
That's
It's just
all
a
it
big
is.
box. So that there was no invention to it. It was just like, well, what if we just put everything in boxes?
None at all. In fact, the only ingenuity of it was to make the box corrugated, so that it would not collapse if you piled a bunch of boxes on top of each other.
But it's sort of so contrary to this notion of this sort of like lab coat expertise that everything needs to be a Manhattan Project. We need to have the Manhattan Project of this or that.
This is the big danger of my friend Joel Mokyr, who's an economic historian. He and I agree on a lot of things, 85% or 90%. But the one disagreement we have is that Joel thinks the modern world comes from science. And I say, well, yeah, science is getting, high science, let's think of it that way, is getting more and more important in the economy. I agree with that. But there's still plenty of very important innovations that have practically nothing to do with science. And certainly the box for shipping is an example.
I mean, an example I love is that sort of cuts across both of those ideas is white LEDs. So my understanding, so everywhere you look now are white LED lights.
Yeah.
They're these little diodes that emit white light, and it's very energy efficient, and it enables all kinds of things. It's in all of our technology.
Well, that's high science, though.
Well, but my understanding is that it was believed by physicists that white LED was impossible.
Oh, really?
It was not something that the periodic table of elements could give us.
That's interesting.
And a non-scientist hobbyist, I might be, if I'm mangling this story, I apologize to listeners, but my understanding is that essentially a non-scientist, much like so many innovations that have come about, didn't know that it was impossible and proceeded to invent it.
Well, I think that's happened a lot. I have the greatest respect for science and scientists. And as I say about Joel Mokyr, I agree with him that it gets to be more and more. I mean, materials science, biological science, these are all terribly important sources of innovation in the modern world. I'm not pessimistic about the future of the American economy. For reasons I've never understood, people like to be told that the end is near, that the world is collapsing, and that we've reached our best point and we're going to recede, or at least things are not going to get any better. And you can sell books if you say that. You remember back in 1960s, the population bomb by Ehrlich said that by now civilization would be over because population is growing too fast and we're going to run out of food. And it's completely absurd. It didn't happen. And then Bob Gordon, my friend at Northwestern, another friend of mine at Northwestern, he wrote a book in 2016 called The Rise, and I guess he called it The Fall of American Manufacturing, of the American economy. And again, I've debated Bob on this. And again, it's just, there's no way to know what the future will bring. And in particular, there are all kinds of signs for optimism that people ignore. They want to hear the sad story. They just love it, and I can't understand why.
It's something in our deep psychology, I think.
Well, I think it is. Look, if you're facing a cave bear as a caveman, you've got to react, and you can't start saying, well, maybe this bear will be friendly. So there's a kind of there's an amygdala response, as the brain scientists say, that's fight or flight, and it comes in instinctively and immediately. So people feel that if you're well, in fact, they'll say things like this. They'll say, "Oh, if you're too optimistic, then you won't be prepared for the evil that the world brings." And people like Joel and Hans Rosling and me are puzzled by this. We don't understand why people feel this way, but they do.
I want to switch gears, but before I do, I want to just sort of put a button on this economics conversation by asking everything we've talked about: innovation, ideas, progress, material progress for the bottom of the bottom billion, the bottom 2 billion, the bottom 10 billion.
Once out of a world population of 5 billion, there were 4 billion in the bottom. 4 out of 5 humans were unspeakably poor. Now it's 1 out of 7 billion. That's how much has changed since the 1960s. There are still very poor people, but the progress has been astonishing.
What does this have to do with property and private property? Why is private property this? Because we started our conversation saying that at the end of the day, the core of socialism is either the abolition of private property or its effective abolition by control.
Yeah, that's right.
So you can nominally own your hospital, but the government's going to tell you what to charge and who to hire and how many doctors are available. So they effectively own it anyway.
And that's socialism too. It's very important to keep in mind that it doesn't have to be full-bore socialism where the government does own everything. Even human capital, which was true in the old Soviet Union and is true in North Korea still. That is, they could boss you around to do this task or that task. No, the reason that private property works is not so much incentives, although people on the left are always talking about that as though that's what made it a good thing. And then they say, why would Bill Gates care if he got another dollar of profit? No, it's that Gates and other people who have proven that they're successful in inventing things and changing the allocation of capital and labor and so forth, they have information, they have the skill to make things better for all of us. The only alternative is people in Washington or Paris making those decisions. Means that you're in charge of deciding what to do with it. And as Hayek and many other people have said, this knowledge about what to do with your shop front in Chicago or your skill as an engineer or whatever is diffused in the society. It's not all located in Washington. And in fact, there's very little of what we should do or it's wise for us to do that's located in Washington. So to get the economy working well and innovating and continuing to do well for poor people, which is what I care about. I don't care about the rich people. I care about the poor people. We've got to let this knowledge get used. And the only way to do it is private property. If you overregulate, as you said, that's essentially expropriating the property owners. And you end up with bad decisions because they're being forced to go in a way that they know is not the best way.
I experienced this and I think a lot of people do. If you've worked in a large company, there's this very interesting dynamic between the particular knowledge, literally knowledge, of your department versus the centralized departments. Like I noticed this. I worked at Viacom for over a decade at different networks, MTV, Nickelodeon, Spike TV, and each one had really unique particulars about how to make the things we were making and how the people worked and who was good at what and how you would go about getting things done efficiently. And the centralized IT department and the centralized human resources department that had to, and this is you're talking about a company whose workforce was about 14,000. So it's about the size of the town I lived in at the time, Verona, New Jersey, like a tiny little town. HR and IT didn't seem to have a clue how the business actually used the stuff that we needed. They would, like, I would routinely, every time I switched positions and got a new computer, I would just erase its hard drive and install my own software.
Yeah, that's what you have to do.
Because they would, like, whatever they thought I was going to do with that computer bore no resemblance to the way I would actually use it. And so so I got this notion of, and so I had to, even though it was technically the company's computer, I needed to be able to treat that computer like my property in order to use it the way that would benefit the company.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's good to point out that large volunteer organizations like a big corporation are like socialism. In fact, that was one of Marx's claims that had a certain plausibility to it, that what would happen is that companies would become bigger and bigger, and then you could just turn them over to the government, and you would have socialized the means of production before socialism. But of course, what he didn't understand is that these big companies have this same problem that socialism has. So it's not a great thing to have socialized the means of production. That turns out to be a lousy idea, because there is this individual, and it's true of lots of administrations. I've always been in academic life. I've never been in the real world. And I've known about 30 or 40 deans in my life, and I know only 3 of them who were any good at their job. And one of the main problems that deans have is that they don't know what the chemist or the English professor knows on the job. And so they're just suits, empty suits, making stupid decisions on the top floor, and they ought to be.
You have tenure, don't you, Deirdre?
I do, but I'm even better. I'm retired. I would say this all the time. They would announce, and you've seen this in the corporate world too. They would announce some new initiative that the new CEO or the new university president wanted to implement, and it was uniformly stupid in a way that wasn't going to make, and then the rest of the company or the university had to figure out ways to get around it. And so you spend a lot of ingenuity avoiding what the suits have told you to do. I mean, after all, that's what the very amusing cartoon Dilbert is all about. Every day he makes this joke.
I wanna bring our long conversation to a close with a different topic, which is, you used to be a Marxist.
Yeah.
You also used to be a man.
Yes, that was quite an experience. My mom says about my gender change, "Dear, don't do anything more interesting." And you can kind of, don't decide to become a horse or something. Now go back to being a boring professor. Just shut up. Don't do anything as more interesting than that.
Tell me about that experience. When did that? Yeah. What did you always have a sense of? What was this? I'm coming at this very cold. This kind of experience.
There are some transgendered people who know when they're 2 years old that they're in the wrong gender, and they'll say there'll be a girl and she'll say, "I'm a boy. I'm a boy. I'm a boy. I won't wear a dress." Blah 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 blah, and vice versa. That's quite common. And my view is that if she keeps saying, "I'm a boy, I'm a boy, a boy," let her be a boy. Because it's one of the big myths against transgender people is that it's irreversible, which is completely ridiculous. I reversed my gender at age 53. So come on, don't be silly. Of course it can be reversed. You don't have to worry about that. But no one feels regret. That's complete nonsense. People also believe that. If from age 11 on, well, let me tell you what I felt at age 11. At age 11, I would go to sleep praying that the next day I wouldn't stutter. I was a stutter at the time, and I still stutter a little bit. And that I would be a girl. I'd go to sleep praying that every night. And my joke is that age 53, I got half of my wish. I still stutter a bit, but I become a girl, so to speak. So as an Episcopalian, I regard that as not too bad percentage. but if maybe as I was a Catholic, I would have got the whole thing. But I can't be a girl in any how can you say this, any deep sense, because I didn't have the experience of being a girl and a woman. Every cell of mine says XY, XY instead of XX, XX. And they shout it all the time. It's very irritating. I wish to hell they'd shut up. But maybe in some magical future we'll be able to change people's cells. You know, you have trillions of cells in your body, and every one indicates your gender. A biologist looking at a cell can instantly tell which is female and which is male. Even in plants, this is true. So, but at age 53, having been married for 30 years to the love of my life, and having had 2 children who are now grown up, I realized that I could change. I was a guy. When I was a guy, I thought like a guy, and now I'm a woman. I've been a woman since 1995. I think more like a woman. I'm starting to forget why men do what they do. I'm starting to get puzzled, like my friends are. What the hell? Why did he do that? I've forgotten what it's like to be a man. But I'm not ashamed that I was a man, and I wasn't miserable. I wasn't a sad sack. I'm a fairly cheerful person. I'm an optimist. If you aren't an optimist and you haven't got a sense of humor, I don't advise that you change gender.
This makes you such an unbelievable character in this intellectual universe, because you are celebrated on what I guess you could call like the American right. Although I think the left right in America is a little bit of a weird.
It's wrong.
Dynamic.
It's completely wrong. I'm not either left or right. I'm above the two, because the left-right spectrum is simply a quarrel about how to use the violence of the state. Whereas we liberals, and I use it in the old sense, we don't want the state to have these powers, at least, for most things. So we're above that spectrum. We're not on it. I'm not right-wing. Do I look conservative? No, I'm telling you.
Well, and I'm sure, I have to imagine you have this conversation, have had it at least once. You come across someone who's a hardcore free marketeer, but sees themselves very much as a conservative, perhaps somebody else. You come across somebody else who's a free marketeer, but also sees themselves as a conservative.
Yeah.
And they are puzzled, maybe even disturbed by your gender transformation and the conversation that's happening in our culture now about. What do you say to them?
Well, I say, dear, you've got to think through your politics again, because you're not really a liberal in the 19th century sense. Because if you're a liberal, you believe in evolution, you social evolution, you're optimistic about the future, you want everyone to be a free person, you want people to do what they want to do as long as they don't damage other people. And if you're disturbed by this because of what you think the Bible says about it, which actually the Bible says nothing about it, then you're not really liberal. You're a conservative, and that's okay. I have friends who are conservative. That's fine. but they're not free market people. They think they are, but they're not. And actually, what is frequently the case on both the left and the right is that they're free market as long as you don't disturb them, and then they want to bring in the fist of the government.
There's an intersection that you stand in the middle of in so many ways, which is, and we talked about this when we last got to spend some time together at in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest. We have this rise of, so you are an academic with a lifetime in higher education institutions. You are a former Marxist who's become a classical liberal, a free marketeer, and you are transgender, which means at the nexus of all of those is a debate. And fourth, that you believe that ideas are the essential engine of progress, and that the intersection of ideas and the spreading of ideas and the challenging of ideas. And so when you bring those all together, there seems to be an entirely counter-revolutionary ethos happening in some university settings and broader, and it's rippling out in the culture that ideas can be violence.
Yeah.
And that there's this notion of a kind of I've heard it called cultural Marxism, though I don't know if what that term means, and maybe you do, and you can explain it to me.
Yeah.
But the sense that your identity defines your thinking such that if you're not of the right identity, your opinions aren't of any consequence and don't need to be listened to. So I'm a white man. I'm about as typical as you get. I'm Italian, so I'm part of various elder patriarchal empires, I guess you could say. So I can't have an opinion on a whole host of things. And so how do you think about this? At being someone who transitioned, especially at a time when it was not so popular.
Yeah, well, it's become very popular. Now I tell people I'm transgender and say, oh, that's interesting. Hey, how about them hawks? They don't care. They honestly, particularly young people, don't care at all. And only a few old people do.
What do you make of this change that's happening around free speech and freedom of expression and the willingness of young people and new people to listen to others and to tolerate
it's
seemingly intolerable ideas?
I know.
And this sort of tribal identification of thought. Like, how do you disentangle that? What's your thought on all this, given all of your experience?
I've had a lot of experiences with it. Once I was, not too many years ago, I was at a conference, small conference at my university, University of Illinois at Chicago, and they had brought in a very intelligent Marxist from New York who gave a little story about economic history in the United States since the war. And I stood up and said, well, very respectfully, and said, well, I think your story is quite interesting, but here's a problem, and I told him what it was, and he reacted as follows. He said, "Oh, I see you're a neoliberal," and sat down. And what startled me is that my colleagues in English and history who were there didn't say, "Now hold it, dear. Deirdre has some standing to speak on economic history. Perhaps you'd better answer her question." No, they didn't do that. They just sat there. And I was quite startled by this. We can make ourselves into voluntary idiots this way. I have an acquaintance in my field of economic history who, at the time of Tiananmen Square, when we all saw the film of the man standing in front of the tank and how terrible it was, and I was saying to her, "God, I think it's terrible. This Chinese government is awful." She said, "I'm not in a position to have an opinion about the brutality of the Chinese government in Tiananmen Square because I haven't checked with my party, by which she meant, I don't know, the nation or something. And I was so amazed by this because it was so obvious that it's not a good thing to attack protesting students with tanks. And she couldn't offer an opinion until she had found out what the party line was. And I just find this amazing in an academic. She was another professor.
In what sense is this? I mean, it's ad hominem logic, right? It's, oh, well, you're a neoliberal, therefore your opinions...
Therefore, I don't need to pay any attention to you.
You know, I mean, it's of the same kind of thought as, well, you're a Jew, so I don't need to pay attention to you, or you're a black, so I don't need to listen to you. It's the same stuff. It's the same stuff in a new white gown.
Sure it is, and it's got the same dangers. It's a closed-mindedness that I find very shocking. The Koch Foundation or Institute is hated on the left, but Charles Koch's views that he supports through his foundation are in fact prison reform, reducing the overreach abroad, military overreach, opposition to the war on drugs, all kinds of things that anyone on the left you'd think would say, oh, that's okay, maybe this Charles Koch is not such a bad guy. But they can't get over the fact that he's among the richest people in the world, and it's just so irritating to them. So, you know, it's all very foolish, and it's not just on the left, it's also on the right. You only have to tune into the worst of Fox News to see that those people are closed-minded too, and they won't listen to anyone else.
In what sense is this identity politics cultural Marxism? Do you have an understanding of that? I mean, that term. What is that? What is that? Is that like some slapdash insult? Is there some legitimate academic origin?
It's an extension of the idea of class interest. You're supposed to be determined by your, as you said, by your position in life. Another word for it is motivism. Ah, comrade, I see why you're talking this way, because we know you're objectively bourgeois. And then I can stop hearing what you're saying. And it's so it's in that sense Marxism. But hey, on the right, on the conservative right, get the same kind of thinking. Oh, I see, you're an atheist, so I don't need to listen to you. Or you're not, you don't believe in a big army, therefore I don't think anything of you and needn't listen to you anymore. And so on and so forth. It's, you know, we're always looking in a complicated world for simplifications. And this is one way of simplifying your intellectual life. It's the rare intellectual who can hold more than one thought in her head simultaneously. I've been on both sides of this. I know the attractions of socialism. I know why people want it. They want to help the poor, and I honor that. That they actually end up hurting the poor is something that they're very unwilling to hear about.
As we draw to a close, I understand that you have a new book coming out. How to be tell me what's the title and what's it about?
Its new title, which my editor suggested, is simply Why Liberalism? ? And from the very beginning, I tell people, look, I'm not talking about the way the word liberal is used in the United States, where it's used to mean slow socialism. I have many slow socialist friends here in the United States and Sweden and Holland and so forth, and I love them, and I think they're wrong, but I don't think they're evil people. But I'm trying to bring since the left in the United States has fled from the word liberal and wants to be called progressive now, it's time for we real liberals to take back the word and stop calling ourselves libertarians, which is a term that confuses people and it makes people think that you don't care about the poor and so on and so forth. I call myself a liberal 2.0 because a liberal 1.0 would be more like some of my friends at George Mason University, who just want to keep giving the libertarian line. And as a Christian, I was once an agnostic, now I'm an Anglican or an Episcopalian. As I said before, I regard helping the poor as one of my main purposes as an economist or as a citizen. And so I call it Liberalism 2.0, and that's what the book's about. It's explaining to people why they really are liberals 2.0, and they should stop calling themselves socialists or conservatives. They're not.
And just define for me, what is a liberal, a 2.0 liberal?
A person who believes that the best society we can have is a society where everyone is free. You know, it comes from the Latin for free person. A liber, L-I-B-E-R, was a free man, as against a slave. That's how it was defined in a slave society. And the more people who are free, the better off we are, is the historical fact since 1800, and is the promise of liberalism. It's not that it just makes us rich, although it certainly has, but that it also makes us good. We stop hating people because they're slaves, or we stop subordinating women to men and blacks to whites and so on and so forth. So that's my idea. That's it's Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer and lots of other, Milton Friedman, all those people, Hayek and Mises, they all believed in a society of free people left alone, not compelled to do things, either by masters, private masters, or by the government. That makes for the best society. Creative. The 2.0 part is merely to admit that we want to help the poor. Instead of saying, "Oh, you poor, you're just you must not be up to it, and you're just a bunch of losers," which is more like what conservatives like Donald Trump say. But one way to summarize it is to say that Hillel of Babylon, the great Jewish sage in the 1st century BCE, put the golden rule in negative terms. He said, the golden rule is, do not do unto others what you would not want to be done to yourself. Okay? And that's like liberalism 1.0. Leave me alone. It's kind of masculine. I'll take care of this myself. Don't push me around. And it's a very good thing. But I believe also in the formulation by another Jewish sage, Jesus of Nazareth, who said, do unto others what you would want done unto yourself. That's the positive way of saying it. And that's kind of feminine. It urges you to be nice, to be the good Samaritan. Do not pass by on the other side, as it says in the Bible. And I think that a liberalism that combines those two is the ideal ethical framework. It's not a complete ethical framework. I've written a whole book on this, but is an ethical framework for a free society, both Hillel and Jesus.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Deirdre. I know
I've enjoyed it.
It's been a real treat for me to just dig in together on such a broad range of thoughts and experiences, and I hope to have another conversation with you again real soon.
Okay, dear. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.